In Game 21 of 1951 World Championship match, the challenger David Bronstein finally played his favorite King's Indian defense. He desperately needed a victory and chose an original opening strategy. As he writes in his annotations, he made 5 consequent moves that served a single purpose, namely to confuse the world champion. Botvinnik fell into this psychological trap and instead of making natural moves played inaccurately and voluntarily created weaknesses in his position. These mistakes let Bronstein seize the initiative and carry out an unusual plan. While black usually attacks on the king side in the king's Indian defense, Bronstein started a direct attack on Botvinnik's weakened queen side. In the arising endgame, Botvinnik tried to create a counterplay, but Bronstein prevented it with accurate play and equalized the score in the match by weaving a mating net around Botvinnik's king. Botvinnik started with d4, Bronstein played knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, e5. Now the exchange of the queens isn't dangerous for black at all. After d takes e, and exchange of the queens, for example, the most aggressively looking move is bishop g5, pinning the knight and opening the king's way to the queen side, after which the rook will check the king, which is stuck in the center, and also white is threatening unpleasant knight d5, attacking the pinned knight. Black might simply play c6, solving all problems, creating a square, retreat square for the king, and also controlling the square so that the knight doesn't jump. And after long castle check, simply king c7 and white doesn't have any advantage whatsoever. That's why after e5, Botvinnik simply develops his knight f3 with tempo, attacking the pawn on e5, and Bronstein defends it. Here the most common move is e4, but Botvinnik chose another common system with a fianchetto of light squared bishop g3. Bronstein in his turn, of course, fianchettos his dark squared bishop g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, e4 and c6. This is also a typical move in the king's Indian defense, to take under control important squares and open the queen's diagonal, and the queen might be developed on the active squares, either on a5 or b6. This position actually occurred in the game between these two opponents in 1945 USSR Championship. In that game, Botvinnik immediately closed the center by playing d5, but after c takes d, Bronstein activated his knight with tempo, attacking e4. Botvinnik defended the pawn, and Bronstein made another typical move for the king's Indian defense, a5, ensuring his knight's position on c5, so that white cannot push it away by playing b4. And Botvinnik didn't get any advantage in that game. But he improved the variation and instead of d5 in this game played h3. Now the most common plan for black would be just capturing on d4 in order to eliminate the important pawn, which controls important central squares. E takes d. And after knight takes d4, knight c5. Black exerts pressure on the e4 pawn after the disappearance of e5 pawn. E-file is open, so the rook will also join the pressure on the pawn on e4, and also the bishop has become much more active after the disappearance of e5 pawn, which limited it. And white, in his turn, exerts very unpleasant pressure on the backward d6 pawn. However, all this was very well known, and Bronstein needed a victory, so he decided to surprise his opponent, to confuse him by hiding his plan for as long as possible. And instead of e takes d, which was a committal move, he decided to start a series of mysterious moves that hides his plans and might confuse the world champion. And it really worked. He played knight h5, which is actually also a typical move in the king's Indian defense. The idea is to unblock the f-pawn, and black prepares after knight h5 usually f5 and f4, followed by g5 and a strong attack on white king, while white plays actively on the queen side. However, in this position, knight h5 actually, from purely positional point of view, is useless, because black cannot play f5 anyways, as you will see, and the knight isn't doing anything on h5. it cannot even jump on f4 because this square is under white pawn control. And the knight on f6 was much better placed as it controlled very important squares, central squares, d5 and e4. But on h5 it isn't doing anything. So from positional point of view, this move is dubious, as Grandmaster Sveshnikov, who annotated this game, called it. However, from psychological point of view, it worked very well, and Botvinnik will take very unnecessary measures against f5, as you will see, which would worsen his position, as you will see. So first he played bishop e3, queen e7. So Bronstein refrains from placing his queen actively on the queen side on a5, for example, and just slightly improves his queen's position, continuing hiding his plans. And here comes the first inaccuracy by Botvinnik. Knight h2, placing his knight on a passive square. However, the idea was to prevent f5, because after knight moved on h2, now the diagonal is open and the queen directly attacks the knight, preventing f5. So now f5, of course, would be a blunder because white would simply capture on f5 and black cannot capture with a pawn because the knight would fall. And also capturing with a rook doesn't work because of g4 and it's a fork. However, as you will see, instead of knight h2, which was absolutely unnecessary, it would have been much better to make a natural move. Rook e1, keeping the knight on a good square from which it controls important central squares, and placing the rook on a better square. And f5 wouldn't work anyways. After f5, white would simply capture on f5, and after rook takes f5, of course, the fork would follow, and if d takes f, again the knight would be unguarded, and white would simply win a pawn by sacrificing the knight. Knight takes e5, and after d takes e, queen takes h5. And of course, e takes d with a fork, which looks like a fork, doesn't work because of rook e1. There is a terrible X-ray here, and bishop takes d4, attacking the queen, and black doesn't have time to capture the bishop. So, instead of knight h2, it would have been much stronger to play rook e1. But Botvinnik made his first inaccuracy. Knight h2. He prevented f5, but the knight is very passively placed on h2 now. Bronstein continues his series of mysterious moves. King h8. Again, he doesn't show his plans and continues making some kind of waiting moves. King h8, rook e1, and now again, as he cannot play actively on the king side, f5 is impossible. He doesn't want to make any committal moves in the center, so the only thing left for Bronstein is to play on the queen side. So he made another waiting move on the queen side, a6. However, this is a tricky move. It's not just a waiting move. It, as you will see, prepares b5, the active play on the queen side. And here comes a serious mistake by Botvinnik. Instead of natural rook c1, he played a3, weakening his queen side. He weakened b3 square and also weakened the pawn on c4 because now white wouldn't be able to play b3 in order to protect the pawn, as the pawn would be blocked on b2, as you will see. So, by playing a3, he weakened very important light squares on his queen side, and that will let Bronstein exploit it and start very active play on the queen side and the attack, the direct attack on the queen side. So, rook b8, preparing b5. Now Bronstein's plan has become clear. Rook b8, bishop f1, in order to prevent b5, because b5 right away doesn't work, because white would simply capture, and after a takes b, play d5, a strong move, threatening simply to capture. If black captures on d5, the knight with great effect would be centralized on d5 with tempo, and c5, of course, doesn't work, because b5 pawn would fall, because it's attacked 2 times. So now you can see the idea behind bishop f1. So that's why, as b5 right away doesn't work, the knight, which has finished its mission, it forced Botvinnik to make mistakes. As you see, the knight is passively placed and the light squares are weakened. So the psychological phase of the opening is finished. But Bronstein reached what he wanted to reach by making all those mysterious moves, and now starts the purely strategic battle. So the knight returns to the center, knight f6, taking under control d5 square. So d5 in the previous variation now wouldn't be so effective, because if the knight would capture on d5, black knight can capture back. So the knight wouldn't be centralized on d5 anymore. Queen d2, and now b5 finally. C takes b, a takes b, rook d1, exerting some unpleasant pressure on d file, and knight b6. So the knight is heading to c4 as it's weakened. And black shows his plans now. He's going to play on the queen side. And here, instead of d takes e, which was suggested by Bronstein, d takes e and b4, fixing the weakness on c6, threatening bishop c5, winning the exchange. That would force black to play knight d7 in order to guard c5 square, and queen d6, attacking c6, which might be unpleasant for black. Instead of this natural way of playing, Botvinnik made his final serious mistake in this game, after which his position was strategically much worse, even maybe even lost. He played bishop h6, offering the exchange of bishops. However, his bishop on e3 was much stronger, was much more active than black bishop, because it controlled both flanks, while black bishop is bad. It's limited by its own pawn, and it isn't really doing anything. It might look like a good move, because it leads to the exchange of bishops, after which the dark squares in black's position would be weakened, and it might seem that white might get some attacking chances on the king side. However, white doesn't have enough sufficient resources for the attack on the king side, and the exchange of bishops would definitely be in black's favor, as you will see. Bronstein exchanges the bishops. Queen takes h6 and bishop e6. Now the bishop also takes under control the weakened light squares on the queen side. Knight f3, bishop b3, attacking the rook, rook d2, knight d7. So the second knight is moving to the queen side. So one knight will jump on c4 and vacate b6 square for the second knight. And the knight might jump on a4, for example, later in the game, attacking b2 pawn. And of course, black is also preparing b4 advance, opening b file, after which the rooks will exert a strong pressure on the main target, as Bronstein writes in his annotations, b2 pawn. And this pawn will fall, as you will see. So, knight g5 doesn't work. So another idea behind knight d7 was to unblock the pawn, and if knight g5, which looks like a dangerous move, creating checkmating threats, simple f6, opening the queen's way, the queen is protecting f7, and the knight is under attack, and the knight would be forced to retreat. So this attack doesn't work, and white simply doesn't have other pieces to join the attack. So as this attack doesn't work anyways, knight g5 doesn't work, the queen isn't really doing anything on the king side, the attack on the king side failed, Botvinnik retreats the queen, queen e3, and that means that Bronstein now completely seizes the initiative. While white doesn't have anything on the king side, the center is reinforced, completely blocked. Black has a very strong pressure and very promising attack on white's queen side, which is weakened. Bishop c4. Now white cannot capture the bishop, because the knight would capture with a fork, attacking the queen and the rook. And Bronstein in his annotations suggests simply to move away the rook, so that knight c4 isn't a fork anymore, either rook d1 or rook c2. Instead of this, Botvinnik moves his bishop, because black is threatening bishop takes f1. And after white captures on f1, the knight would jump on c4 with a fork again. And Botvinnik moves his bishop. However, this move is a mistake. And Bronstein writes that Botvinnik completely misplayed his bishops in this game. First, he voluntarily exchanged his good dark squared bishop for black's bad dark squared bishop, and now he avoids the exchange of his bad light squared bishop, which is limited by the pawn on e4, for Bronstein's good light squared bishop. So instead of bishop g2, it would have been better to move away the rook so that the knight c4 isn't a fork anymore, but bishop g2. f6, reinforcing the center and preparing the advance on the queen side. And there is nothing white can do against it. White doesn't have any counterplay. Rook c2, bishop b3 attacking the rook, rook e2, knight c4 attacking the queen, queen d3, knight a5, rook d2, knight b6. So the knight is going to jump on c4. Now d takes e doesn't work. After d takes e, queen d6. This doesn't work because of queen takes d6, rook takes d6, and knight c4 attacking the rook and the pawn, and there is no way white can defend it because rook d2 doesn't work, as this square is also under the knight's control. That's why Botvinnik played queen b1. Knight c4 attacking the rook and the pawn on b2. Rook e2, and now everything is ready for b4. Now the b file opens, and the rooks would exert very strong pressure on the weakness on b2. A takes b, rook takes b4, vacating b8 square for the second rook, and that means the pressure would be simply intolerable. And what can white do? White cannot just sit and wait and observe how black crushes his queen side. So Botvinnik tries to create some counterplay on the king side, h4. However, he simply doesn't have sufficient resources on the king side. Knight b6, knight a2, attacking the rook, and the exchange of the bishop for the knight. Bishop takes a2, queen takes a2, and knight c4. So there is no way white can protect the pawn on b2, as after h5 the second rook joins the attack, and the pawn is attacked 3 times, and white simply cannot defend it. H takes g, h takes g. Now if rook b1 defending the pawn, Bronstein gives the following move. Queen b7, threatening knight b3, followed by rook a8, attacking the queen, and the queen would be trapped. So that's why the natural move rook b1 in order to defend the pawn doesn't work. So queen b1, but that means that the pawn will inevitably fall. However, Bronstein isn't in a hurry. He will take the pawn next move. First, he improves his king side, king g7. The king is better placed on g7 and it defends the pawns. White might have played knight h4 probably with a fork ideas, but now white doesn't have anything. D takes e, f takes e, queen c1, white cannot defend the pawn anyways, and knight takes b2. Winning a pawn and threatening knight d3 with a fork. So besides positional advantage, now black has material advantage, extra pawn. Queen c3, knight a4, again attacking the queen, queen c1, and here Bronstein was in time trouble and he didn't find the strongest move, c5, so the passed pawn simply advances and black would win much easier. But he played rook c4, attacking the queen. And as the queen becomes a target of attack on the queen side, Botvinnik sealed a move queen g5. So the game was adjourned at this point, and Botvinnik sealed the move queen g5, offering the exchange of the queens, hoping to save this hopeless endgame. However, as you will see, Botvinnik will do everything in order to create counterplay. Queen takes g5, knight takes g5, knight b3. The knight, which wasn't doing anything on a5, is rerouted on the great central square on d4. And Botvinnik finds the only chance to create counterplay. f4, defending his knight. And now if he manages to invade the 7th rank with his rooks, for example, rook a2, and if the knight moves rook a7 check, then that would be very unpleasant for black. If king f6, then knight rook f7 checkmate. If king h6, then rook h7 checkmate would follow. However, as you will see, Bronstein would prevent all this. So first he centralizes his knight with tempo, attacking the rook, knight d4. Rook a2, and now white has two threats, as Bronstein writes. One is rook a1 doubling on a file and attacking the knight, and if it moves, rook a7 check. And another is bishop f1 with tempo, attacking the rook and opening the rook's way on h2, threatening invasion from the king side. Rook h7 check would be unpleasant. But Bronstein prevents both of these threats. Rook b2, attacking the rook and offering the exchange. Rook takes b2, knight takes b2, and now if rook a1, threatening unpleasant rook a7 check, Bronstein in his annotations gives a simple variation, maybe not so simple, tactical variation, which prevents this threat. You can pause the video and try to find it. So it's tactics. Rook c1 check, and after rook takes c1, the fork comes. Knight e2 check, and after this, white stays with a bad bishop, and black has an passed pawn, which would advance supported by two knights, and white's position would be hopeless. That's why after knight takes b2, Botvinnik played king h2, so that rook c1 doesn't come with check. Knight d3. Now the second knight is very active, attacking the rook, and also f4 pawn is under attack now. Rook e3, attacking the knight, so black doesn't have time to capture on f4. Rook c3, defending the knight, and black is simply threatening to advance the c pawn and defend the knight with a pawn on c4, after which the rook would be free. It wouldn't be forced to defend the knight anymore and would would invade the second rank. That's why bishop f1 immediately attacking the knight, so that black doesn't have time to move the c pawn. That's why the only thing black can do is rook c2 check with tempo. Now if king g1, then Bronstein gives the following variation: knight c1, rook a3, threatening a check, but knight e2 check, and also attacking f4 pawn, and black is winning another pawn. That's why Botvinnik moved his king to h3. However, now Bronstein will start weaving a mating net, and the king would be in danger. Knight f2 check, king h4, rook c1 attacking the bishop, bishop g2, rook g1 again attacking the bishop and forcing it to move on h3, and rook h1, and now white is paralyzed. The bishop is pinned. The knight cannot move because black would simply capture the bishop, and the king cannot move anywhere. h5 is under pawn's control and g4 is under knight's control. So white is paralyzed. F takes e, d takes e, rook a3 again, threatening rook a7 check, but king f6 taking under control g5 square. Now the king wouldn't have any squares to move, and black is simply threatening knight e6, attacking the defender of the bishop. And after white captures the knight, black would first, of course, capture the bishop and then capture the knight, winning a piece. And if rook a7, then simple tactics: knight f3 check, and the knight must capture, and checkmate immediately would follow. That's why after king f6, knight h7 check followed. King e7, knight g5, knight returns on g5, and now Bronstein missed a simple victory, knight e6, attacking the knight, and if knight captures, then of course first check and then capturing the knight, winning a piece. He played king d6. However, he will have again the chance to win the speed, so he hasn't missed much. Knight f7 check followed. king e7, and now if the knight returns to g5, we would get the similar position which occurred 2 or 3 moves ago, and again knight e6 would win immediately. That's why this time Botvinnik played king g5. However, of course, this loses a piece, so king takes f7. Rook a7 check, king e8, bishop d7 check, king d8, king takes g6, knight takes e4, g4, rook f1, bishop f5, knight takes f5, g takes f, king e8, and in this position Botvinnik resigned. Hit the like button as it's really helpful for the channel growth, and see you in the analysis of game 22.